The night was still in the small rural town of Cedar Creek. The moon hung high, casting a silvery glow over the quiet streets, its soft light dancing on the rooftops and the wide open fields that stretched beyond the town. There was no breeze to stir the leaves, no sound to break the serene silence. The kind of night that seemed to hold its breath, as if the world itself was at peace. But then, at the stroke of midnight, the tranquility was shattered. A sudden, eerie howling pierced the silence, slicing through the stillness like a blade. It came from the woods just beyond the town's edge, raw and haunting, echoing against the hills. The cry was not the normal bark of a dog, but something primal, strange, desperate, and filled with a sense of foreboding. Inside the nearby farmhouse, Sarah Mitchell stirred from her sleep. The sound of the howling reached her bedroom window, sending a shiver down her spine. She blinked into the darkness, disoriented, her pulse quickening. Her dog, a loyal German shepherd named Max, was not one to make such noise. He'd always been a quiet companion, his calm presence a constant in her otherwise quiet life. The howling continued, its tone growing more unnerving with each passing second. Sarah's chest tightened with a growing sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but the night remained as peaceful as ever, save for that one piercing sound. Max's sudden growl from the corner of the room made her freeze. The dog, usually so calm, was now on alert. Something in the air had shifted, and she had no idea what it meant or what was coming next. Sarah Mitchell had always believed in the quiet life. In the small town of Cedar Creek, she had found peace among the rolling hills and open fields. Her farmhouse, tucked away from the bustle of the outside world, had become her sanctuary after years of running from her past. It was here, in the serenity of the Montana countryside, that she had hoped to finally find some semblance of healing. At 57, Sarah's face bore the marks of time. A few silver strands of hair threading through once dark locks, lines of worry etched gently into her skin. She was not the woman she used to be. The vibrant woman who once ran marathons, who laughed with friends in bustling city streets, had been replaced by someone who now found solace in the stillness of nature. Life had not been kind to Sarah, but she had learned to carry the weight of her burdens in silence. The hardest weight of all was the grief she carried for her late husband, Tom. His sudden death 3 years ago had shattered her world. Tom had been the love of her life, her companion through thick and thin. Together, they had built their dream home on this very land, but when illness took him away, Sarah was left to pick up the pieces alone. The house, once filled with laughter, had become unbearably empty. The silence of the rooms was deafening, and each night, Sarah lay awake in the bed they had once shared, the absence of his warmth beside her more painful than any physical wound. It was during that lonely time that she found Max. A German shepherd with a troubled past, he had been abandoned at a local shelter, left to wander through his own trauma. But something about Max spoke to Sarah, something deep within her. She recognized the sadness in his eyes, the same emptiness she saw in herself. He had been through his own hardships, his own losses, and in him, she saw a reflection of the life she could never quite shake off. Their connection had been instant. Max was more than just a pet. He became her anchor, her constant companion in a world that had become too quiet. Every morning, he would wait at the foot of her bed, his dark eyes watching her, ready to begin the day as if nothing could be wrong in the world when they were together. He was her reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could still be light. His loyalty was unquestionable, his calm presence a balm for the soul. He had become not just a dog, but a living memory of all that she had lost, and all that she still held dear. Their daily routine was simple. Sarah would wake early, the first light of dawn creeping through the curtains, and the sound of Max's paws padding across the wooden floor was always the first thing she heard. They would walk the perimeter of the farm, just the two of them, surrounded by the vastness of nature, where the only noise came from the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. Max would walk beside her, his strong body steadying her with each step. They were a team, Sarah, with her tired eyes and heavy heart, and Max, with his unspoken understanding and unwavering devotion. Life had been predictable, almost peaceful, in the way that only a quiet rural life could be. But beneath the surface, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Max had always been alert, aware of every sound, every movement in the wind. He had always been protective, a silent guardian who seemed to watch over her. But recently, there had been something different. He had become more restless at night, pacing the floors, his ears twitching at sounds Sarah couldn't hear. He had started to stare out the window in the dark hours, his eyes fixated on the trees, the same trees that stood unmoving in the distance, the ones that always seemed to be watching, waiting. Sarah tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered like a shadow, creeping into her thoughts when she wasn't paying attention. Max's howls, though rare, had always been a thing of concern. But lately, they had become more frequent, almost nightly. At first, she told herself it was nothing more than an overreaction, a nervous dog reacting to the wind, or perhaps the sounds of wild animals passing through the woods. But with each night that passed, the howls grew more unsettling. They were no longer the playful calls of a dog at rest. They carried an eerie tone, a desperation that made Sarah's heart race. Max, too, seemed to sense it. He would stand by the door, his body tense, ears alert. His once calm demeanor had started to slip. On the rare occasions when she tried to soothe him, he would recoil, his body trembling with an anxiety she had never seen in him before. But Sarah couldn't explain it. She couldn't put her finger on the cause of his unease. Life had been quiet in Cedar Creek, too quiet. No one ever spoke of strange happenings in the town, but there was something about this particular stretch of land that always felt different. She had heard the whispers from neighbors about the house she had inherited from Tom's family, whispers about its history, old stories, long forgotten, about lost souls and things that went bump in the night. She had never paid much attention to them, dismissing them as folklore meant to scare children. Yet, in the quiet moments, when she found herself staring out the window, her hand resting on Max's soft fur, she couldn't help but wonder if the land held a secret that Max was trying to uncover. Something he had seen before her, something that had been waiting, hidden in the shadows of the night. As Sarah prepared for another quiet evening, the house settled around her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Max had gone to his usual spot by the window, his eyes once again fixated on the woods. The wind had begun to stir, rustling the leaves outside, and the air had grown cooler. It was the same stillness she had grown used to, yet tonight, something felt different, off, as if the world had shifted ever so slightly. And then, in the distance, she heard it again. The howling. This time, it was louder. It wasn't the normal howl she had grown accustomed to. It was deeper, more desperate. Something primal in the sound sent a chill down her spine. Max stood, his body tense, his growl low and steady. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw the fear in them. It was then, in the dead of night, that Sarah realized the howling was not just a call from the wilderness. It was a warning, and the world she had known was about to unravel. It was exactly midnight when the howling began again. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, unaware of the shift that was occurring outside. The wind had calmed, and the world around Sarah was still, too still. But then, that unmistakable sound filled the night air. The first howl was sharp, like a sudden burst of sound that seemed to shatter the silence. It was unlike anything Sarah had heard before. Max was usually so quiet, so calm, yet tonight his voice broke through the stillness with a haunting intensity. The cry pierced the quiet like a jagged knife. It wasn't just a dog's howl. It was a desperate wail, a primal, guttural cry that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the house. It echoed in her chest, deepening the sense of unease that had already settled within her. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her ears as the howl reverberated through the room. It was different this time, longer, louder, and filled with an eerie desperation. The air in the room seemed to shift with the sound, growing heavier, charged with something she couldn't quite name. The howling continued, spiraling into an unsettling crescendo that made her skin crawl. It echoed through the open windows, filling the entire house with a sense of looming dread. Max, who had been lying quietly at the foot of the bed, now stood rigid, his head tilted back in an almost unnatural position as he howled along. His voice joined the chorus, but his was a howl of something more than fear. It was a howl of pain, of loss, of something he couldn't escape. Sarah could see the tension in his muscles, the way his body was trembling with each desperate cry that escaped from him. She had never seen him like this before. She reached out a hand toward him, trying to soothe him, to pull him close, but Max pulled away. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with fear, and for the first time, she could see it clearly, he was terrified. His usual calm, his sense of protection, was gone. In its place was a raw, instinctive panic that filled the room. "Max, it's okay," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. She reached out again, but this time, Max backed away, his ears flat against his head, his body stiff as a board. The howling outside grew louder, almost deafening, and Sarah's heart raced faster. The howls now came in waves, one after the other, a series of sharp cries that seemed to bounce off the walls of the house, shaking the very foundation of the place. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees in an eerie counterpoint to Max's cries. But it wasn't just the sound that unsettled Sarah, it was the way it seemed to vibrate deep within her, reaching into places she didn't want to acknowledge. It was as though the howl was coming from something beyond. Max's eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah felt a strange connection. It was as though he was trying to tell her something, trying to communicate a message she couldn't quite understand. His growl was low now, almost mournful, but there was also a sense of urgency in it. A warning, perhaps, or a cry for help. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something was wrong. Something beyond the howl was pulling at her, beckoning her to listen, to understand. The howling continued, relentless, as though the world itself was trying to communicate a message that only Max could understand. Sarah stood up, pacing around the room, trying to find a way to calm her thoughts. She moved to the window, staring out into the blackness. The moonlight bathed the land in a cold, ghostly glow, but there was no movement beyond the reach of the trees. The world was still, except for the howling. "Should I go out there?" she asked herself aloud, her voice barely a whisper. The doubt hit her like a wave. Was she just overreacting? Was this just the sound of some wild animal in the distance, some coyote or wolf roaming the woods at night? She shook her head, trying to push away the unease. Max had always been a calm, level-headed dog. If he was reacting like this, it had to mean something. But what? And why did it feel like it was calling to her? Sarah's eyes flicked back to the door, her gaze lingering on the darkened hallway. The door to the outside was just a few steps away. All she had to do was open it and step outside, into the night that seemed to be calling her. But there was fear there too, a cold, quiet fear that made her hesitate. What would she find out there? Could it be something dangerous, something lurking in the woods? Or was she simply imagining things? Max let out another howl, this one more desperate than the last, and it snapped Sarah out of her hesitation. She couldn't ignore this. She couldn't sit here in the safety of her house, pretending nothing was wrong, not when Max was so clearly in distress. The connection between them was stronger than her fear, stronger than any doubt. Without another moment's hesitation, Sarah moved toward the door, grabbing her jacket and wrapping it around her shoulders. Max was already standing by the door, his body pressed against the wood, his ears perked, waiting for her. There was no question now. Something had to be out there, and Max was trying to lead her to it. It wasn't just the howling anymore. It was the dog's instinctive reaction, his desperate need to go beyond the familiar and uncover whatever force was calling him. "Let's go, Max," Sarah whispered, opening the door, the cold night air rushing in. The sound of the howling was almost deafening now, reverberating through the night. She stepped out onto the porch, Max at her heels, and the world around them seemed to hold its breath, as though it were waiting. Sarah's heart raced as she walked toward the edge of the property, the howling growing louder, as if something unseen was urging her forward. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but she couldn't stop now. Max's howls guided her, and for the first time, she understood that they were not just a sign of distress, they were a call. Max stopped at the edge of the woods, his body rigid, and stared into the darkness beyond. Sarah felt a pull in her chest, a strange compulsion to move closer. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't ignore it. Something was out there, waiting for her to find it. And tonight she would. As she stepped into the darkness, the howling stopped abruptly. A silence descended over the land, heavy and suffocating. The only sound now was the beating of her own heart. And somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the rustle of movement, the faintest whisper of something that didn't belong. Something was waiting, and Sarah could feel it in her bones. The air outside the farmhouse was thick with the smell of earth and the chill of night. The moon hung above, casting a soft glow that barely penetrated the dense thicket of trees ahead. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, her breath misting in the air. Max, by her side, moved cautiously, his body low to the ground as he led her through the unkempt trail that wound around the back of the property. She had never ventured this far. This stretch of land was overgrown, forgotten. When she'd inherited the house from Tom's family, she'd stuck to the well-worn paths, the ones that led to the barn, the pastures, and the open fields. But tonight, Max was pulling her into the deeper shadows of the property, his ears flicking at every sound, his eyes scanning the darkness like he knew something was out there, something waiting to be found. With each step, the silence of the night grew heavier, the kind of stillness that felt suffocating. The howling had stopped, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over. Every step she took felt like it led her deeper into a mystery, one she wasn't sure she was ready to solve. But Max was insistent, his presence beside her steady and unwavering. They passed an old stone wall, its crumbled edges barely visible beneath the overgrown ivy. Sarah stopped, her eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar sight. She didn't remember this part of the property. Tom had been meticulous about maintaining the land, yet here she was, walking into an area she couldn't recognize. The land felt foreign, the trees casting long, strange shadows that didn't seem to align with the moonlight. Max let out a low growl, his body tense. Sarah's breath hitched, and she instinctively reached down to stroke his fur. "What is it, Max?" she whispered, but he didn't respond. He just stood still, his ears pricked forward, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. It was as though something had caught his attention, something she couldn't see. Without warning, Max darted forward, slipping through the thick underbrush. Sarah hesitated, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. She followed, her feet crunching against the dry leaves as she pushed forward, trying to keep up with the dog's swift movements. "Max, wait," she called softly, but he didn't slow down. Instead, he continued toward the trees, his pace quickening as if he were being drawn to something unseen. Sarah caught up to him just as he stopped abruptly, standing still in front of an old, decaying cabin. It was hidden deep in the woods, so far off the beaten path that she couldn't fathom how she had missed it for so many years. The cabin was small, barely standing, its wooden structure sagging and covered in moss and vines. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung on one hinge, creaking in the breeze. Her heart began to race as she stared at the cabin. It didn't belong here. It was as if it had always been hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The sense of something ancient, something forgotten, settled deep in her chest. Max's growl was quieter now, but still tense. His body was rigid as he stared at the cabin. Sarah felt a shiver crawl up her spine. There was something about this place, something wrong. She had never seen it before, but it felt like it had been here for far longer than she could imagine. Like it had been waiting for her. "What is this place?" she muttered to herself, but Max's growl deepened, pulling her attention back to him. His eyes flickered toward the door, and then, as if driven by an instinct she couldn't understand, he took a few cautious steps forward. Sarah followed, her curiosity pulling her closer despite the creeping dread that had begun to take hold. She reached for the door, its surface cold to the touch, covered in layers of grime and decay. It didn't budge at first, but with a little pressure, the hinges creaked and the door slowly opened with a loud groan. The interior of the cabin was dark and smelled of old wood and mildew, but there was a strange, almost metallic scent in the air, something sharp and unnerving. Max stepped inside first, his form just a shadow in the dim light. Sarah hesitated but followed, stepping carefully over the broken floorboards. The room was small, with a single beam of moonlight filtering through a crack in the roof, casting long shadows across the space. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the edges curling and torn, but there was something else, something she couldn't place. In the center of the room, there was an old, rusted metal box. It was buried beneath layers of dust and debris, its surface marked with deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Sarah approached it cautiously, her heart pounding. She couldn't explain why, but she knew that whatever was inside that box held the key to everything. The howling, the strange feelings, and the sense that something had been buried here for far too long. Max stood beside the box, his tail rigid, his stance alert as if he knew exactly what it was. He let out a low whine, almost as if he were trying to warn her, but Sarah couldn't back away now. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached for the box. The moment her fingers brushed the cold metal, the room seemed to shift, the air growing colder, heavier. A faint noise echoed through the room, an almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice, distant and muffled. It sent a wave of unease crashing over her, but she couldn't pull away. Something compelled her to open it. With a final breath, she unlatched the rusty clasp. The box creaked open, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Inside, there was a small, weathered journal, its leather cover cracked and stained with age. She picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The pages inside were yellowed and fragile, but the writing was still legible, a series of notes written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The first few pages were filled with what seemed like random scribbles, scraps of thoughts, half-formed sentences. But then, as she flipped further, the entries became clearer. The handwriting was more deliberate, as though the writer was trying to record something important, something they had uncovered in the dark corners of this very land. One entry stood out. The howls have begun again. The land calls. The old spirits are restless, and they are searching for what was hidden long ago. The dog knows. He can feel it just as I do. We are not alone here. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The howls, the ones Max had been reacting to. The connection between the dog and this land, was it all tied to this journal? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. She had inherited the house from Tom's family, but there were things about this property that had always felt off. Tom had never spoken of this cabin, never mentioned the land or the secrets it might hold. But now, everything was starting to make sense. Max whined softly, his eyes locked onto the journal, as if he too understood the weight of the discovery. It was more than just an old book. It was a key, unlocking the mystery that had been buried here for years. But what was it they were uncovering? What had been hidden, and why had the howling started again? Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine as she realized the answers might be far darker than she had imagined. The land wasn't just calling, it was demanding something from them. And now, it was up to her and Max to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She turned the next page, her fingers trembling. The secrets were beginning to unravel, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what was coming next. But Max was by her side, his quiet, steady presence grounding her. Whatever awaited them in the dark, they would face it together. And the howling would not stop until the mystery was solved. The wind outside had picked up again, howling through the trees in a way that seemed to echo the pain and turmoil buried within the land. Sarah felt the weight of that air, thick with tension, as she carefully held the journal in her hands. The pages were old, fragile, as though they had witnessed years of darkness, and now they were revealing secrets she was not sure she was ready to confront. Max was by her side, his presence quiet but unwavering, a constant reminder that she was not alone, but that this journey she was about to embark on would test both of them to their limits. The moonlight, pale and silvery, filtered through the cracks in the walls of the cabin, casting eerie shadows on the floor. It was as though the cabin itself had a life, and every creak, every whisper of the wind through the trees was part of the story it had to tell. Sarah's breath caught in her chest as she read the journal, her eyes scanning the faded ink with growing horror. The entries began to make sense, but the deeper she read, the more overwhelming the truth became. The land remembers, one of the earlier entries began. The blood spilled here calls to the spirits, to those trapped by the curse of the earth. And the dog, he is the key. He will lead the way, but he will also be the destroyer. Only by understanding the pain of those who came before can we hope to stop the cycle. The howling is the first sign. It is not a cry of distress, but a summoning, a call to arms from those who were lost. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she read those words. Her eyes traced the last sentence again, as though her mind refused to accept the meaning. A summoning. The howling she had heard so many times in the dead of night was not just a cry for attention, not just the howl of a restless dog. It was something far darker, far more primal. It was a message. And Max, with his howls and his strange behavior, was not just a victim of it. He was part of it. Max shifted beside her, his body low, his fur prickling with tension as if he knew what was coming. Sarah's fingers tightened around the journal, and she fought the urge to close it, to push away the terror that had begun to sink its claws into her heart. But she couldn't turn away. She couldn't deny it anymore. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the image they formed was something she didn't want to see. The next entry seemed to deepen the mystery even further. It is no accident that the Mitchell family was drawn to this land, it read. The bloodline is cursed, bound to the earth by old promises and older secrets. We were meant to come here, to stir what was buried, to complete the cycle. The dog, his role has always been clear. He is both protector and destroyer. The howl is his call to the spirits, but it is also a warning, a signal that the land is awake. We have only until the full moon to uncover the truth or face the consequences. A feeling of suffocation washed over Sarah as she read those words. The land was awake. It had been waiting for her to uncover the truth about what had happened here, what had been buried in the soil for generations. The thought sent a ripple of fear through her. Her heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced. The Mitchell family, her family, was tied to this curse, to this land. Her great-grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, had been a part of it all. And now, Sarah had unwittingly stepped into the same trap, one set in motion long before her birth. Max shifted, his eyes growing more intense, and Sarah knew in that moment that this was not just a mystery. It was a story of blood, of loss, and of something far older than her understanding. The land called to her. Max's growl interrupted her thoughts, low and guttural, as if responding to the growing weight of the truth in the air. Sarah could feel it too, the pull of something ancient, something powerful, rising from the earth beneath her feet. She stood up abruptly, her knees shaking. She needed to know more, but the fear inside her was overwhelming. She was not ready for this, not ready to face what was coming. But the journal and Max had shown her that there was no turning back now. "Max, what have we stumbled upon?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The dog's ears flicked back, and his tail remained low. He didn't answer her, of course, but the way he stood beside her, unmoving, spoke volumes. He wasn't afraid. No, he had always known more than she did. He had been prepared for this moment long before she had ever set foot in the cabin. But she wasn't ready to let go of the fear. The weight of the past, the burden of the curse, felt suffocating. Max moved forward, slowly and purposefully, toward the door of the cabin. Sarah watched him, her heart heavy in her chest. Was he leading her to more answers? Or to something darker, something that might destroy her peace forever? She couldn't let fear control her, not now. She had come too far. Taking a deep breath, she followed him. The wind had shifted, and now it felt colder, sharper. The air around them felt thick, as if the very land itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Max's presence beside her, as comforting as it was, couldn't hide the strange energy that now surrounded them. The howling had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like something was about to happen, something that would change everything. They made their way back through the woods, Max leading the way, his body low to the ground as though sensing something in the trees. Sarah felt a tremor in her hands as she stepped carefully over the uneven ground. She had never been this far into the woods before, but now she was moving with purpose, following Max's instincts, trusting him in a way she never had before. The clearing came into view again, and this time, Sarah could see the old stone monument clearly. The trees surrounding it were tall and ancient, their branches twisted and gnarled as if they had been standing watch for centuries. The air seemed to thicken as they approached, and Sarah's breath hitched. It was as though the land itself was alive, and it was watching her every move. Max stopped in front of the monument, his body stiff, his head raised as though he were listening to something beyond her reach. Sarah stopped too, her eyes scanning the area. The clearing was silent now, but the unease in the air had only grown stronger. She felt it deep in her bones. Something was waiting. Something was about to reveal itself. "I'm here," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "I found it. I've found you." For a long moment, there was nothing. No wind. No sound. Just the steady beating of her heart as she stood there, frozen in place, with Max by her side. But then, as if summoned by her words, the howling began again. It wasn't the same as before. It was louder, closer, as though it were coming from the earth itself, rising up through the ground beneath her feet. Max's body tensed, his eyes locked onto the monument. The howling grew louder, and Sarah realized with a shock that it was not just the dog howling, it was the land itself calling to them. The spirits, the curse, it was all tied together, and now Sarah could feel it, pulling her in. A voice, soft but clear, whispered in her ear, "You are the one. The bloodline. The time has come." Sarah turned, but there was no one there. She could hear her breath coming in shallow gasps, but the voice lingered, hanging in the air like a forgotten memory. She turned back to the monument, her mind racing. The howling reached a fever pitch, and Sarah knew, in that instant, that she was no longer just a witness. She was part of this. The land, the curse, the spirits, they had been waiting for her, waiting for the moment when the past would finally rise and claim its due. Max stood tall beside her, his body rigid, his eyes focused on something she couldn't see. The mystery was no longer something she could ignore. The truth had been laid bare before her, and now it was time to face it. Sarah took one final, steadying breath, her eyes fixed on the monument. The howling echoed through the night, louder than ever. And then, as if everything had led to this moment, she stepped forward. It was time to uncover the truth. Max stood tall beside her, his body rigid, his eyes focused on something she couldn't see. The mystery was no longer something she could ignore. The truth had been laid bare before her, and now it was time to face it. Sarah took one final, steadying breath, her eyes fixed on the monument. The howling echoed through the night, louder than ever. And then, as if everything had led to this moment, she stepped forward. It was time to uncover the truth. And whatever it was, Sarah knew that once she did, nothing would ever be the same again. Max moved with her, his steps firm and unyielding as if to say, "We're in this together." The howling had stopped. The forest around Sarah and Max was still, the only sound now the soft rustling of the wind through the leaves. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the air felt lighter. The heavy weight that had been pressing on her chest seemed to lift, though not without leaving behind a raw emptiness, a lingering ache of something lost, something found, and something terrifyingly unfinished. Max stood beside her, his head lowered, his eyes fixed on the monument ahead. The dog's eyes had always been full of depth, but tonight, they seemed to carry an understanding that Sarah had not known he was capable of. His fur bristled slightly, and yet there was no growl, no tension. It was as if Max himself had arrived at the same place she had, the point where everything had converged. The howling had been a signal, a call from the spirits of the land, a cry from the past reaching forward through time. And in that moment, Sarah understood. The land had always been haunted by the weight of its own history, and she, too, had been part of that history, though she had never known it. The Mitchell family, her family, had lived and died by the land's curse. Eleanor Mitchell had tried to bury it, but like all things left unspoken, it had resurfaced, seeking resolution. It had been waiting for Sarah to return to this place, to this moment, to understand the howling, and to understand herself. Her great-grandmother, Eleanor, had been the keeper of the land's secrets, the one who had witnessed the bloodshed and grief that had soaked into the earth. But instead of confronting the past, Eleanor had buried it, seeking peace in denial. The ghosts of the land, those that had been wronged, had waited for someone to take responsibility for what had happened here. The land had called Sarah back, not just because of bloodlines, but because she was the one who could end the cycle, the one who could reconcile with the spirits of the past and put them to rest. Max, in his quiet way, had always known this. He had always been connected to the land, to its spirits, in ways that Sarah could not yet comprehend. But now, as she stood before the monument, her heart full of both fear and determination, she could see the role that Max had played in her journey. He was not just a dog. He was a guide, a protector, a bridge between her world and the world beyond. And tonight, he had fulfilled his purpose in ways she had never imagined. Max's growl broke the silence, but it was different this time. It wasn't a growl of fear or warning. It was a growl of strength, a growl that spoke of loyalty and understanding. Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with tears she hadn't known she'd been holding back. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing me the way." Max moved closer to her, his large frame steady and firm. He sat down beside her, pressing his body against hers in a gesture of comfort, his warmth grounding her as she absorbed the gravity of the moment. The howling had been a cry from beyond, but it had also been a call to her, to face the truth of the past, to heal, and to break the curse that had bound her family to this land for generations. Sarah closed her eyes, her mind racing as she sifted through the memories, the stories her grandmother had whispered to her in the quiet corners of the house. She had always dismissed them as fairy tales, stories of old family lore, things that didn't matter anymore. But now, standing here, in this place where the veil between the living and the dead was so thin, she realized how wrong she had been. The stories were true. The ghosts were real. And they were waiting for reconciliation. The land's curse was born of betrayal, of violence, and of unspoken guilt. It had been set into motion by a terrible wrong, one that Sarah's great-grandmother had tried to bury under layers of time and silence. The family had taken something that wasn't theirs, something that had belonged to the land, and in doing so, they had bound themselves to its pain, its sorrow, and its fury. The howling had been a reminder, a summons to confront what had been lost. As Sarah stood there, in the stillness of the forest, she could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. She could feel the presence of those who had gone before, Eleanor, her ancestors, the spirits of the land, and she understood that this was her moment to reconcile with them. It was not just the spirits of the land she needed to make peace with, but also her own demons. The loss of Tom, her loneliness, the guilt of never understanding the true history of her family, had all been a part of the curse. They too were bound to this land. But now, standing before the monument, Sarah understood that she could finally let go. She could heal. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as the words escaped her. "I'm sorry for the pain we've caused." I'm sorry for all that we've taken and never given back." The wind began to stir again, soft at first, but then stronger, as though it were responding to her words. The trees seemed to sway, their branches bending toward her in an ancient, knowing gesture. The air had shifted, lighter now, as if the weight of years of suffering was finally lifting. Sarah felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace, a peace she had not known in years, as if the land itself was forgiving her, releasing her from the grip of its past. Max stood up beside her, his tail now wagging gently, his body relaxed. He had always been a silent guide, a protector in ways Sarah had never fully appreciated, but now she understood. He had been the one to guide her back to this place, to help her confront the past, to heal. And in doing so, he had not only helped her heal, but he had also healed himself. The bond between them was stronger than ever, rooted in mutual understanding, loyalty, and the shared weight of their experiences. As the wind died down, the air around them seemed to settle. The howling had stopped for good, and the forest felt quieter, more at peace. The tension that had once filled the air had lifted, leaving a quiet calm that was both soothing and final. Sarah looked down at Max, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt a sense of closure. But there was one more thing, one lingering question that still nagged at her heart. "Max," she whispered, her voice soft. "Are you just a dog?" Max looked up at her, his eyes steady, unblinking, and for a moment, Sarah swore she saw something more in his gaze, something ancient, something beyond her understanding. There was no answer, of course. Max simply licked her hand, his tongue warm and reassuring, before resting his head on her lap, his body settling into a peaceful stillness. Sarah chuckled softly, her heart full of love and gratitude. Whether or not Max was something more than a dog didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he had been her guide, her protector, her partner in this journey of healing. The past had been laid to rest, and the curse had been broken. There would be no more howling in the night. Max had fulfilled his purpose. And now, so had she. As Sarah stood to leave, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The journey was over, and the land had been set free. And as she and Max walked back toward the farmhouse, with the rising sun casting a warm glow over the land, she knew that whatever mysteries remained, whether supernatural or otherwise, would never feel as heavy again. The healing had begun. And with Max by her side, she was ready to face whatever the future held. The end of one story was only the beginning of another. Several months had passed since Sarah stood in the clearing beneath the old stone monument, her heart heavy with the weight of the past. The howling had ceased, the land had healed, and with it, Sarah found a sense of peace she had not known in years. Life in Cedar Creek had returned to its familiar quiet rhythm, but it was a rhythm now laced with a deeper understanding, a quieter joy. The shadows that once lingered at the edges of her world had slowly receded, replaced by a soft, steady light that seemed to seep into every corner of her life. The farmhouse, once a place of sorrow and silence, was now filled with the hum of life again. Sarah had taken to the daily routines with renewed vigor. Early mornings, long walks with Max, tending to the land Tom had loved so much. The house felt fuller now, not because the echoes of the past had disappeared, but because Sarah had made peace with them. She no longer feared the land, nor the memories that had once haunted her. Instead, she had come to see the land as a living thing, full of stories and lessons, just as she was. Max, always by her side, had become the symbol of her healing. He had been her protector, her guide, and now he was her companion in the quiet moments of life. His once tense, watchful eyes had softened, and the way he moved, steadily, calmly, was a testament to the bond they had forged, not just through shared trials, but through mutual understanding and love. Their walks through the fields had become a kind of ritual. They would leave the house early in the morning, the first light of day spilling over the hills, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink. Sarah would carry a thermos of coffee, and Max would trot alongside her, his tail wagging lazily as they made their way to the farthest corners of the property. They had both found peace in these simple walks. It was as though the land itself had forgiven them, and now they were a part of it, fully immersed in its quiet majesty. The cabin, the monument, and all the ancient secrets of the land were now just memories, tucked away in the corners of Sarah's mind. She had kept the journal, of course, a fragile record of the past that had unlocked so much. But she no longer felt the need to revisit it. The past was no longer something to fear. It was something to honor, to acknowledge, and then to let go. In a way, that was the greatest lesson the land had taught her. Sometimes healing doesn't come from resolution, it comes from acceptance. And Sarah had accepted what had happened here. She had accepted her place in the story, just as Max had accepted hers. One afternoon, several weeks after the resolution of the mystery, Sarah sat on the porch with Max at her feet, the warmth of the sun heavy on her skin. She had been thinking about the events that had unfolded, about the ghosts of the past that had tried to bind her to their sorrow. But now, as she sat there, she saw it all in a new light. She remembered the first time she had stepped into the woods, drawn by the howling, her heart full of dread and confusion. She had been searching for answers, for something she could hold on to, something that would make sense of the loss and the grief that had filled her life. What she had found instead was not just the land's curse, but a deeper understanding of herself. She had confronted her own demons, the grief over Tom's death, the loneliness that had gripped her heart for so long, and the secrets she had buried deep inside. And with Max by her side, she had learned to heal, to forgive, and to move forward. It was strange, Sarah thought, how much life could change in such a short time. A few months ago, she had been lost, wandering in the dark corners of her own mind, trying to escape the memories that had chained her to the past. Now, she felt as though she were standing on solid ground, finally free from the weight of the history that had once felt so oppressive. She had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, she had helped the land do the same. Max stirred beside her, his head lifting as he caught the scent of something on the wind. Sarah smiled softly. It was as though he could sense her thoughts, could feel the peace she had found. He nudged her gently with his nose, his eyes soft and steady, as though to remind her that they had come through this journey together. And that was the most important thing, she realized. They had faced the darkness together, and now they stood in the light of the future. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the fields. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the distant hills. Max, always vigilant, sat at her feet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It was a peaceful scene, one that she had never imagined would be possible after everything that had happened. But here she was, surrounded by the land, the house, and Max, the dog who had saved her from the very darkness that had threatened to consume her. As the evening settled in, Sarah's mind wandered back to the howling, the strange, eerie cry that had first drawn her into the mystery of the land. At the time, she had feared it, as anyone would fear something unknown, something that seemed to promise only pain. But now, she saw it differently. The howling had not been a curse. It had been a cry for help, a call for reconciliation. It had been the land's way of asking for peace, of demanding that the past be acknowledged and set to rest. And in the end, that was exactly what had happened. "Max," Sarah said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "do you think we're done with the howling?" Max turned to look at her, his gaze steady, as though he understood her question, as though he had always known the answer. He gave a soft bark, one that was neither fearful nor mournful, but reassuring. His tail wagged gently behind him, and for a moment, Sarah felt the familiar pull of his loyalty, the same loyalty that had carried them through the darkness. It was then that she heard it. The howling. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the desperate cry of a ghost or the call of a spirit seeking vengeance. It was soft, distant, almost like a sigh on the wind. Sarah turned her head, her heart skipping a beat. Max's ears perked, and he turned his gaze toward the distant woods. The howl echoed through the night, but it wasn't a sound of sorrow anymore. It was a sound of peace, of closure. Sarah realized, with a strange sense of calm, that the howling was not something to fear. It was a reminder, an acknowledgement that some mysteries, some connections, would never fully resolve. They would linger in the air like whispers, their meaning shifting with time. Some things, Sarah whispered to herself, are meant to remain a mystery. She smiled softly, her heart full of gratitude, and turned to Max, who was already settled back at her feet, his body relaxed, his eyes soft. The bond they shared, one built on loyalty, healing, and understanding, was unbreakable. The journey had changed them both, but it had brought them together in ways neither of them could have imagined. As the last echoes of the howling faded into the night, Sarah knew that she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She had found peace, and with Max by her side, she would continue to move forward, no longer bound by the past, but free to live in the present. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt at home. The wind rustled through the trees, and in the distance, the howling began again. But this time, it was not a cry for help. It was a song of peace. And as Sarah sat on the porch, with Max resting beside her, she realized that some mysteries, though never fully understood, were meant to be left to the winds of time. She closed her eyes and listened to the howling, no longer afraid. It was the sound of the land, the sound of the past, and the sound of a bond that would never be broken.